Newsnight now on BBC2 with Jeremy Vine.
Tonight, is the government about to get tough with the striking firefighters? It's emerged soldiers are being trained on red fire engines and will cross picket lines if they have to. We'll find out how much can be done to avert next week's planned 8-day strike. You're a member of the local gym and your local video store, so why not now join and run your local hospital? Think we're joking? Meet the man who isn't. And the forgotten minority, the Kurds living around the border with Iraq and frozen out in Turkey's elections. Good evening. The sight of fireworks exploding uncontrollably from the roof of a blazing depot in Manchester brought home the impact of the firefighters' strike. The soldiers who attended the blaze didn't have the ladders they needed. The government looks similarly at a loss as it works out what to do in the face of an impending 8-day strike. We're joined now to hear the news from Manchester by Ben Brown. You've been watching a spectacular fire, Ben.
Yeah, a rather late Guy Fawkes firework display here in Manchester today. It's out pretty much now, certainly contained by the troops. Their commanders are saying they've done a good job, but at its height, this was a very dangerous fire indeed. It started at about 3:30 this afternoon in a warehouse in the centre of Manchester. It had lots of fireworks inside which were exploding. It also had gas cylinders inside which were a real danger to surrounding homes and buildings, and there were fears that this blaze could spread across Manchester city centre, so it was imperative it was dealt with. Now the troops managed to get there within about 8 minutes, a pretty fast response time, and it's taken them a good few hours to put it out, but they have now done so.
Interestingly, at the beginning it seems that firefighters broke away from their own picket lines to try and do something. Does that mean the strike is softer than we were thinking?
I'm not sure. I think really that it was pure coincidence actually that this fire broke out literally across the road from the Manchester Central fire station. Now there was a picket line there, quite a few angry firefighters who are very committed to the strike, but when they saw this fire starting, in fact they raised the alarm, bizarrely enough, by getting on their mobile phones and dialing 999. Then they raced across. They saw a man was inside the building. They got him out. They evacuated people from nearby. They said really they didn't have a choice. They had to make sure that no one's life was in danger. So they did that. Having done that, they then went back onto the picket line and simply watched the troops and the Green Goddesses doing their best to control this blaze. And I think the strikers were doing that with pretty heavy heart and very mixed emotions. They felt committed to the strike, but at the same time, as professional fighters who've spent all their lives fighting fires, they were really distraught and distressed to be watching other people struggling to cope with this blaze.
Ben Brown in Manchester, thanks very much indeed. Well, the government seems to have miscalculated. It didn't want to train troops to use red fire engines because ministers thought that would infuriate the firefighters and make a strike more likely. Now it's happening anyway. The Green Goddesses look miserably inadequate and training on red engines has only just begun. Ben Gagan looks at the way this strike and the next are being handled.
In Islington today, there was every sign that plenty of people still back the firefighters. By early afternoon, Sherry Everett had collected more than 200 signatures in support of the strike. She's a single mother of 2 and says she can barely afford to live in London. But today, her decision to go on strike had to be set against the fact that overnight, 3 people have died in fires across the country.
If the firefighters hadn't been on strike, then you would not have heard about these 3 deaths last night, and I don't really think that it's fair to blame the firefighters being on strike for the death of these people. It's very unfortunate, and our hearts go out to the people and their families, you know, but at the end of the day we're trying to sort of weigh up between the safety of the public, which is what we're here for, and also our own livelihood.
It isn't just the firefighters who've been facing questions about endangering the public. Today, as the Green Goddesses struggled to provide cover, the government was being criticised for not allowing the army to use all the modern equipment currently lying idle in fire stations. There are more than 2,200 fire appliances at stations throughout the UK, along with specialist communications equipment, breathing apparatus and cutting tools. Most of the gear is now owned by specialist companies who lease it back to local authorities. But it's the firefighters who run the stations and who are now standing in picket lines outside them, so they are in physical control of the equipment. It is ultimately the government who'll decide whether or not the fire engines can be handed over to the army. That could mean asking soldiers to cross the picket lines. But whether ministers are ready to risk such a confrontation with the firefighters is still unclear. It emerged today that there are between 100 and 400 further fire appliances, like these ones in Birmingham, which are held in reserve or used for training and are beyond the control of the pickets. Today the Conservatives asked why they aren't being used to assist the decrepit Green Goddess fleet.
Would the Deputy Prime Minister now confirm to the House that ministers were mistaken in their answers? And would he also confirm that there is no practical reason why troops should not be using today's firefighting technology rather than the antiquated kit of 50 years ago?
The Deputy Prime Minister told MPs that the Army preferred to use the older vehicles.
They prefer to be with the Green Goddesses because it's a familiar technique and it's the same to them all. In the many fire engines that would be available, they don't have the training for that, and there's many different types of vehicles. I must take the advice, I think you must agree that I have to take the advice of what commanders would say.
This evening, Downing Street confirmed that 15 engines from the National Fire Service College have been given to help train the Army on modern appliances. One backbench Labour MP agrees the Army shouldn't have to rely on outdated equipment.
This is public equipment, and the Army personnel involved are trying to provide the best emergency cover they have in the circumstances, and they need to have the best equipment and training that we can realistically provide.
These are just basic things like hoses now.
The big question is whether ministers might decide to allow the Army to use the machinery behind the picket lines.
Today, Downing Street said that if the planned 8-day strike goes ahead next Friday, it'll be a completely different ballgame. The suggestion was that by then, the Army might be allowed into fire stations like this one to drive away the equipment.
I certainly think that, you know, the government, by taking this course, by upping the stakes in the way that they're suggesting they might do, would certainly encourage some union members and some firefighters to feel that they need to do exactly the same back to up the stakes in order to be able to defend themselves.
This dispute could still get nasty. During a strike 4 years ago in Essex, part-time firefighters crossed picket lines.
Certainly it came to intimidation. There were threats to people's family, to their houses, and certain telephone calls in the middle of the night, etc.
The government is signalling a tougher line with the strikers. So what chance is there now of actually resolving the dispute?
We can discuss that now with the Minister involved, Christopher Leslie, who joins me in the studio, and also on the line from the Fire Brigades Union, John McGee. Mr. Leslie, first of all, how long do you think it takes people to train on these red engines?
Well, obviously we're in the middle of a strike situation that hasn't occurred for 25 years, and as far as the government's concerned, we're trying to put safety at the top of our priority list by having the fleet of Green Goddesses out there. But certainly it's a fair question to ask about the use of the red engines.
I'm asking how long you think it takes people to train to use them.
Well, there are a lot of different types of engines. There's a lot of difficult technical kit out there.
Well,
not every
roughly
engine.
How long?
Well, we've seen differing estimates of that. The point is,
well John Prescott says 12 weeks.
Well, we know now that at the Fire Service Training College there are about 15 appliances that we might be able to begin training on as soon as it's practicable to do so. But don't forget that the firefighters have actually been using the red engines until the strike began, so it wasn't possible to have that level of training before that time.
You have got some in reserve though, haven't you? And the question now is whether they can be trained to use them before the next strike on the 22nd.
Well, we're hoping that we're not going to get to that, and I think it's important to look at the context of this, which is why we're having a strike. Don't forget, it's about a 40% claim, 40%.
Now, I'm
when
asking
inflation's only 2%.
about their abilities to use these red engines.
Well,
this is really important.
I really hope that we won't need to do that, because if the Fire Brigade Union see public opinion, as I think it's shifting, they see the 11% offer on the table there, most reasonable people would want to take that and come back to work.
John McGee, if soldiers break the picket lines to get these red engines out of the stations and use them, what will happen?
Well, first of all, Mr. Leslie has just said that we're seeking a 40% pay rise. I think we need to come back to that we're seeking professional pay for firefighters. We're seeking a wage of £8.50 take-home pay per hour for firefighters. And instead of the government trying to beat this strike and find ways of beating the Fire Brigades Union, they ought to be sitting down making an offer.
We're going to come on. We're going to come on to the figures in our next discussion, Mr. McGee. But first of all, this point about soldiers getting red engines from stations. What will happen if they do?
Well, I mean, really we shouldn't be talking about whether soldiers get red engines from the fire stations or not. What we should be talking about is the professionals that are standing outside at this point in time of those fire stations, getting back on them and providing the first-class fire service that this country is used to.
But Number 10 is saying tonight that troops will cross the picket lines, if necessary, on the 22nd.
Well, that's what I find very provocative by the government, and we've been accused of being provocative, and the only people in this dispute that are being provocative is the government. They instead of finding ways of getting the red engines out for the army to use, they ought to be sitting down with us and having serious negotiations on the level of pay for our members, in order that our members are riding on those appliances and providing the service.
You say they're being provocative, but Paul Embry, who's one of your members, said in the piece we've just heard, we need to do the same back to up the stakes. What does he mean by that?
Well, I think that there's a very strong feeling of frustration on our stations and our members out there. They feel that they are under attack by this government, a government that we campaigned to get elected, oddly enough, and here they now believe that they're under severe attack, and of course our members are angry, and they sometimes say things that perhaps it's not been articulated exactly what they want.
Mr. Leslie, watching the pictures today of firefighters, in some cases unable to fight fires properly because of these green goddesses, aren't you ashamed of how unprepared you've been?
Well, we never said, and we're not pretending that we can provide a fully equipped second fire service in case there's a strike every 25 years. We have a basic level of cover with the Green Goddesses. And obviously the armed services, 19,000 of them, are trying their level best to do as much as they can. But I agree with Mr. McGee on one point. Actually, if we can get the firefighters back to work, that is what we really want for public safety. But they need to come off this 40% claim.
Right, well, we're going to talk about that shortly, and I know you're both staying with us. Let's move now to any deal that could be done to end the strike. The firefighters, as we've said, wanted 40%. An independent review suggested 11 might be more like it. Paul Mason looks at whether there is any way back from the brink.
Andy has been leading the negotiations. I'm sure you all want to be updated. I'm afraid I have to say to the press, we're in a very serious and dangerous position that this government has put us in. So we'd need to ask if you could leave the room.
Andy Gilchrist began the day by ejecting the press from a mass meeting in Scotland. Newspapers had depicted him as a fat cat and his union as stooges of Saddam Hussein, so the mood was bad. But one comment held out a glimmer of light.
We've set out one or two ideas about how we might progress this dispute to a satisfactory conclusion.
And what are these ideas?
Well, they're a matter for us and whoever we wish to talk to about, but obviously we don't remain static in an industrial dispute of this magnitude. We need to be thinking with imagination about how we get a satisfactory conclusion to this for the firefighters of this nation.
So what might he be thinking about? What are the possible ways out of the dispute? In the Commons today, the Deputy Prime Minister made clear that the Bain report is not the final offer.
Even now, they have an opportunity to make an input. Sir George's position paper is not a final report. It's been put forward at this stage to help those negotiations. The employers have made clear that they stand ready to continue discussions at any time. Wouldn't it be better to negotiate? Wouldn't it be better to sit down again? Because an 8-day strike can only lead to more deaths, more injuries and more distress.